Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. This Civ overview is all about the Bulgarians. Now they're an infantry and cavalry civilization, with, fittingly, an infantry and cavalry unique unit. On top of that, they also have great siege and a unique defensive building that packs a lot of punch for its cost. Bulgarians offer a lot of really powerful options, especially in the late game, somewhat comparable to, I think, either the Teutons or the Slavs. Unlike both of those civilizations though, they also have a strong power spike in the early feudal age, letting them be played in a very aggressive style as well. So far they sound pretty good. Let's check them out. To start with their team bonus, Bulgarians and their allies all have 50% faster working blacksmiths, which means every minute of research time for a normal civilization instead just takes 40 seconds. That can be nice for taking advantage of reaching a new age, or when tech switching into a new type of unit. In total, that gives the potential to save up to just over 4 minutes of research time for some civilizations. It's not the most exciting team bonus, but comes in handy especially for Bulgarians, considering their unique unit needs both infantry and cavalry techs. But speaking of saving time on upgrades, the next bonus is that they get the Militia-line upgrades for free. Now there are a few implications for that, with the earliest being for their men-at-arms rushing potential. Not only does it save 100 food and 45 gold while giving your militia 5 extra HP and 2 attack, but you also save the 40 seconds of research time by getting it instantly when you reach feudal age. Mid-fight and without warning, your opponent can be suddenly up against much more threatening units, at no cost to you. On open maps where it's easier to rush, that can help balance the playing field when you're up against civilizations with good eco bonuses. That said, it can also be convenient in the late game to have those free techs in case you want to suddenly switch into two-handed swordsmen. Not only are they great against eagles with +8 attack, but they also do well against pikes and light cavalry. Don't forget, in Definitive Edition, the swordsman line is better than ever with the new tech supplies, lowering their food cost. To add to that, Bulgarians also have access to a unique tech that makes them even better, which we'll take a look at a bit later. The trade-off is that they're missing champion, which means they miss out on another 10 HP and end up being weaker to ranged units. Overall though, it's a solid bonus, saving 160 seconds and over 800 resources, staggered between feudal to imperial age. I think it's safe to say that infantry is always a good option for Bulgarians at any point of the game. The next bonus is that their town centers cost half the normal stone. Reducing the wood and brick composition of your buildings in favor of wood, what's the worst that can happen? I'm sure it'll be fine. It ends up being a nice flexible bonus that you could use to free up stone for defensive buildings or walls. Keep in mind that most civilizations can only make 2 additional town centers with their starting stone, whereas Bulgarians can make 4, expanding your options on a closed map like Black Forest. Likewise, it can also help out in less obvious ways, like allowing you to make a second town center after building a defensive tower. Without collecting additional stone, that's something that's only possible for Bulgarians and Incas. You can also make 2 town centers and still have enough left over to stonewall a choke point, but I think you get the idea. The point is that the total savings themselves will probably only be 100 to maybe a few hundred stone at the most, but it can still be handy in a variety of ways. One of the things you might, in fact, decide to use your extra stone for is their last civ bonus, the Krepost. I've looked at it in depth before, and in nearly every way it could be thought of as a smaller version of the castle. It has about half the HP and is faster to build, but at the same time it has nearly the same damage output. They may be small, but they're feisty. In fact, I'd argue as a defensive building, it gives quite a bit better value than towers or castles, and is a contender for the title of the best defensive building available to any civilization. At the same time, it doesn't end the castle's whole career. Its production is limited to only their unique unit, whereas the castle has the ability to research technologies, including 2 that directly help the unique unit give value over the long run. You also need a castle to create trebuchets, so in practice I think it's still always worth making a castle at some point for those reasons, especially for the unique tech Stirrups. After the first castle though, additional Kreposts start to look like a more cost-efficient way to defend strategic areas of the map or put pressure on your opponent. So those are their bonuses. So far, it's easy to see why they're an infantry civilization, but also one that lends itself to a defensive-minded booming strategy. It's easy for Bulgarians to add in more town centers and defend themselves with mini castles that can spam their unique unit. Speaking of which, let's move on to their iconic unique unit, the Konnik. I've talked about the unit in depth before, but to summarize into a quick overview, it has the unique feature of having two lives, one as a mounted unit and a second as an infantry. In Castle Age, the mounted version is arguably better than a knight for 5 gold less, and you even get a slightly weaker long swordsman afterward for free, giving quite a lot of long-term value. In Imperial Age, the mounted version is comparable to the Cavalier, plus something slightly weaker than a two-handed swordsman. Again, theoretically that's good value if you consider the cost of those units, and practically speaking as well, having the infantry unit appear in the middle of a fight can be a big edge when matched up against anti-cavalry units. It's enough that they can end up trading reasonably well against a larger group of halberdiers, for example, which is not something the knight line can say. The fact they switch types mid-fight means that by their nature they're a difficult unit to properly counter without using a combination of anti-cavalry and range support units. That is, unless you have Samurai or one of a few other very specialized units. Now all of that said, they do come with a few drawbacks. The most important, I think, is their large upfront cost. They need both infantry and cavalry upgrades, which can add up quickly. In addition to that, the mounted version secretly has quite a slow attack rate compared to the knight line. It really needs their unique tech Stirrups to be effective in combat. That tech can only be researched at a castle, so going straight for Krepost into Konniks has the built-in disadvantage that the Konniks don't perform nearly as well. Altogether, getting their combined upgrades through to Imperial Age costs about the same as upgrading Paladins, and there's still a gold-intensive unit after that, as well as one that needs to be created from stone buildings, as opposed to stables. Another drawback to the unit, besides the high cost to upgrade and create, is that it doesn't survive arrow fire quite as well as the Paladin. Even when you factor in the HP of the dismounted version, it only takes 45 shots as opposed to the Paladin's 60. So when raiding or against strictly ranged units, I think the Paladin in that particular case is the better choice. So that's their unique unit. They're a big investment, more so than the average unique unit, but also offer important advantages, especially against infantry or camel civilizations. Next, we'll take a look at their unique techs. The first we've already seen, and that's Stirrups, which lets their light cavalry and Konniks attack 33% faster. I want to stress again exactly how much better this makes their Konniks, and that it's worth building a castle just to prioritize it. Konniks give good value after, but not necessarily before Stirrups, so it's always an important tech for them. Keep in mind though, this also affects their light cavalry, including the Hussar, who end up beating all other civilizations' Hussars one-on-one. Of course, there are lots of different types of bonuses that affect Hussars, and a one-on-one test doesn't necessarily show they're the best in every situation. Tatars are better against ranged units, Cumans are created faster, and Berbers are cheaper, just to list a few, but in head-to-head matchups, Bulgarians should consistently come out on top. To add even more strength in melee situations, the Bulgarians' Imperial Age unique tech adds melee armor, this time to their Militia-line. Now the regular champion does start with 1 more melee armor, which the Bulgarians are lacking, so in practice, instead of adding +5, it's more like +4 melee armor in exchange for 10 less HP and 1 less attack. It's pretty expensive considering they only end up slightly better than champions in melee combat, roughly on the same level as the Viking champion, while at the same time their less HP means they're weaker to ranged units. The time this unique tech shines is against low attack enemies, where Bulgarian two-handed swordsmen take 1/3 the damage that champions do against halberdiers, for example. But let's not go overboard and say they're challenging the Teutonic Knight. In fact, they get schooled pretty bad. The thing to remember is after the tech, Bulgarian two-handed swordsmen end up being better at melee fights than the champion, and worse against ranged units. Also, don't forget to pick up supplies if you're going to be making a lot of them. So that's the Bulgarians' unique unit and techs. At this point, hopefully you can see why they're also a cavalry civilization, and that you're being pushed toward a combination of swordsmen and either the Konnik or another stable unit. To get a more complete picture of other choices available to you throughout the game, let's take a look at the tech tree, starting with the archers. Right off the bat, I don't love lacking an early economy bonus for the archers, and that's followed up by also missing the crossbowmen, which is pretty awkward. Like the Spanish, you can maybe do a surprise archer rush, but it's not a great long-term play. They're also missing the hand cannoneer and even the final armor upgrade, meaning their elite skirmishers will lag a bit behind because of that. On the other hand, the cavalry archers are actually pretty solid, only missing the last bit of armor. Though in general, I think Bulgarians already handle melee units quite well, and you won't really need a lot of archer support. The cavalry archers save it enough to be a C+, but in most games, I'd say you're probably better off just avoiding the archery range. Next up is the Infantry. Now they are missing champions, but I'd argue their 5 extra melee armor on two-handed swordsmen more than offsets that if you can afford the upgrade. Considering their free Militia-line upgrades, I think there's a lot of utility to the swordsman line in both the early game and late game. I'd say it's an A- for infantry, really just held back because there's so much competition with other civilizations who have some really amazing infantry bonuses, on top of also having the champion of course. Moving on, let's take a look at the cavalry. In this case, there's no direct early economy or cavalry bonus, so they can be outcompeted when going for scouts or early knights. As the game goes on though, they have arguably some of the best hussars available, on top of paladins and the Konnik, which holds up really well against the normal cavalry counters. If left to properly boom and prepare, they're top tier in what they can field, but there's a window before that where they can seem downright average at the stable. I'd say it's an A for cavalry, but with the caveat that it's more like a C+ early on, and takes a while to reach that potential. Moving on, let's take a look at the siege. Overall, it's a really solid tech tree, just missing the bombard cannon. Only 11 civilizations have access to the siege onager, and only 8 have access to that and siege ram, so they're immediately in an exclusive group. Again, there's no direct siege bonus here, but I'd say it's an A- just based on the openness of the tech tree and siege engineers. Next up, let's take a look at the Navy. Early on, again, there's nothing really here to help them out. They do have access to the fire and demo rafts, but that's true of just about all civilizations. I'd say it's a C early game on the water. For the late game, they're also missing a lot of techs, which might not be critical to holding water, but can certainly be helpful. I'd say again it's a C in the late game for a C overall. You have galleons with bracer, and that's about it. Taking a quick look now at the monks, up until now they've had a lot in common with the Slavs, and I think this is where they set themselves apart, with their monastery actually being pretty weak in comparison. Sanctity gives monks 50% more HP, and block printing gives them 3 more range, so missing both of those isn't ideal. They do have redemption to convert enemy buildings in siege, but between that and again a complete lack of relevant bonuses, I'd say it's an average-ish B- for monks. Moving on, let's take a look at their defenses. Not having fortified walls, arrow slits, and bombard towers sets a bit of a negative tone, but the Krepost is definitely a help, especially in replacing towers. They also save some stone with their cheaper town centers, making it easier to wall and build defensive structures. I also like the Konnik as a defensive unit that can be created to counter units either weak to cavalry or infantry. I'd also include the free Militia-line upgrades here, which can be helpful in spamming sword units during an emergency. I'd say they're a solid defensive civilization, but you need to meet them on their own terms and make use of their unique building and cheaper town centers to control the map. Overall, I'd give them a B+ for defenses, though I know a lot of people aren't going to like their lack of fortified walls. And finally, taking a quick look at the economy, I know it's come up a few times, but again, the early game is fairly weak. The only direct economy bonus is their cheaper town centers, and arguably that just helps make defensive structures. At the same time, they're missing two-man saw and guilds, which weakens their late game a bit. I'd say it's a B- for the economy. Considering they're particularly strong hussars, I wouldn't say they're in a terrible position for the late game though, and they have the potential to get some pretty good value out of the units that they make. So that's the Bulgarians' tech tree. Infantry and cavalry aside, I think siege is also something you really want to make use of given their large variety. In terms of good strategies to think about when playing Bulgarians, the foremost is a good man-at-arms opening. They don't excel at many of the other standard openings, like their scouts, which are pretty generic, and their archers, which are not a great long-term investment considering the lack of crossbow. In Castle Age, there is some potential to a light cavalry and stirrups combination, given how much better plus 33% attack rate really is, but there's also nothing wrong with playing it safe and going for something more conventional, like knights or transitioning into Konniks. Even if you're not going for Konniks, I think Krepost can be a good standalone option, either defensively or as an alternative to a castle drop to put pressure on your opponent. If you are going seriously into Konniks, again though, I think you really want a castle to pick up these stirrups tech early. As you can see, Bulgarians have quite a few solid options to pick from, and I think they hold their own on just about any land map. Given a bit of time to tech into their powerful units, they can become quite difficult to counter. But those are my thoughts on the Bulgarians. I appreciate everyone who's been requesting this video, and hopefully it gives you a few ideas to try in your next game. Special thanks to Samantha, Benjamin, Jean-Paul, and everyone else on Patreon for generously helping support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.